The morning of August 26th, 2000. Marriott Hotel, Queens. A nameless, sleepy place nestled in the shadow of LaGuardia Airport. No one thought history would change in such an insignificant place. But behind the door of the third-floor suite, a universe had collapsed. Lying on the bed was Allman Woody. The world called him the Thunder God, the giant of the Allman brothers and Gov't Mule, the man whose existence was defined by volume, by his earth-shattering bass lines. But on that morning, the thunder had stopped. There was no violence, no chaos, just a heavy silence that surrounded the man who was supposed to be indestructible. This is the story of 450 abandoned guitars, the story of a learned scholar imprisoned in the body of a hulking giant, the one who spent his whole life building walls of sound to hide his fragile heart, was finally swallowed by silence. Douglas Allman Woody was born on October 3, 1955 in Nashville, Tennessee. Now, when we say Nashville today, we think of the neon glitz of Broadway, the polished pop country machine of Music Row, the bachelorette parties on pedal taverns. But the Nashville of 1955 was a different beast entirely. It was a city of contradictions, a place where the sacred and the profane lived next door to each other, often sharing the same cup of sugar. It was Music City, yes, home to the Grand Ole Opry and the Ryman Auditorium, where the ghosts of Hank Williams and the Carter family still walked the floorboards. But it was also a hard, working-class town. It was a hub of commerce, transport, and industry. It was a place where men worked with their hands, where calluses were a badge of honor, and a soft handshake was a sign of untrustworthiness. Allman was born into the friction of these two worlds. His father, William Woody, was not a man who chased spotlights. He was a man of the earth, literally. He worked in grueling blue-collar jobs, in the kind of grueling, back-breaking labor that built the infrastructure of the post-war South. He was a man who understood the value of a dollar because he had sweated for every single cent. In the Woody household, reality was something you could touch, something you could build, something you could lift. And then there was Allman. From the moment he could walk, it was clear that Allman was different. He wasn't built for the construction site. He was a big kid, sure, eventually growing into a burly, imposing figure, but his sensitivity was vibrating on a different frequency. While other boys in the neighborhood were playing stickball or dreaming of driving trucks like their fathers, Allman was listening. He was absorbing the sonic landscape of the South. The radio in 1950s Tennessee was a magical, chaotic transmission. If you turned the dial one way, you got the high, lonesome wail of bluegrass and country, music that told stories of heartbreak, trains, and God. Turn it the other way, especially late at night when the signal was clear, and you caught the dangerous, driving rhythm of R&B and early rock and roll filtering in from Memphis or Chicago. You heard the blues, the deep guttural cry of a people who had been downtrodden but refused to be broken. Allman didn't just hear this music, he dissected it. Even as a child, he had an analytical mind. He didn't just tap his foot to the beat, he wanted to know why the beat made his foot tap. He wanted to know how the pieces fit together. He was a mechanic, but instead of engines, he wanted to take apart symphonies. This created the first great conflict of his life, the primal wound that many artists carry. It was the conflict between his father's definition of work and his own burning passion. To a man like William Woody, playing a guitar wasn't work, it was play. It was a hobby. It was something you did on the front porch after you had put in your 8 hours of real labor. The idea of a grown man making a living by plucking strings seemed precarious, perhaps even a little undignified. It was air, not earth. Allman loved his father deeply, and that blue-collar ethic was ingrained in his DNA. He would never lose it. Throughout his career, Alan Woody would approach the bass guitar with the mentality of a construction worker. He didn't play delicately. He worked the instrument. He wrestled with it. He showed up on time. He set up his gear and he delivered the goods, but the tension remained. There was always that voice in the back of his head, the voice of the Nashville working class whispering, "When are you going to get a real job?" Perhaps to bridge this gap, to legitimize his passion, or perhaps simply because his intellect demanded it, Alan didn't just start a garage band. He did something that would set him apart from 99% of the rock musicians of his generation. He decided to study music, and not just study it, he decided to master it academically. We need to pause here and appreciate the sheer anomaly of this. In the lore of Southern rock, the typical origin story involves a rebellious teen dropping out of high school, stealing a guitar, and learning to play by jamming along to Muddy Waters records in a humid garage until the police show up. Alan Woody went to college. He enrolled in a university music program. This wasn't a place for three-chord rockers. It was a serious academic environment, a place of sheet music, classical theory, upright basses, and conductor batons. It is a world of precision, discipline, and high art. Imagine a young Alan Woody in this environment. He was a big guy, a local Nashville boy, walking the halls with students who were likely groomed for symphonies and orchestras. He was studying the architecture of Bach, the emotional complexity of Beethoven, the dissonant challenges of Stravinsky. He was learning to read music fluently, to understand counterpoint, harmony, and complex time signatures. This education is the secret weapon of Alan Woody's legacy. It explains everything about why he sounded the way he did. When he later played in rock bands, he wasn't just following the root note of the guitar, he was composing. Listen to his bass lines in Gov't Mule or the Allman Brothers. They don't just sit there, they move, they weave, they act as a counter melody. He would often play a harmony line to the guitar solo, something a classical cellist would do in a string quartet, but he did it at 120 decibels with a fuzz pedal. He treated the electric bass like a lead instrument because, in his head, the distinction between lead and rhythm was academic. It was all just music. But the conservatory had its limits. The pristine, air-conditioned practice rooms of the conservatory could teach him technique, but they couldn't teach him feel. They couldn't teach him the grime. They couldn't teach him the specific kind of desperation that fuels the best rock and roll. So, Alan lived a double life. By day, he was the diligent student, the redneck Mozart, analyzing the mathematical perfection of Western classical music. By night, he was prowling the Nashville club scene, and Nashville in the 1970s was exploding. It wasn't just country anymore. There was a bubbling undercurrent of jazz fusion, of progressive rock, of funk. He found himself drawn to the complex, high-speed world of fusion. He loved bands like Weather Report and Return to Forever. He worshipped Jaco Pastorius, the man who liberated the fretless electric bass. Alan wanted that freedom. He wanted the technical prowess of jazz, but he wanted it delivered with the visceral punch of rock. He joined a jazz fusion group called Montage. It was here that he cut his teeth. Fusion is an unforgiving genre. You can't hide in fusion. If you miss a beat, the whole intricate house of cards collapses. Alan learned to play fast, he learned to play complex rhythms, and most importantly, he learned to listen. He learned that a band is a conversation, not a monologue. But despite his talent, despite his education, despite the local buzz he was generating, Alan Woody was still just a local guy. He was a big fish in the Nashville pond, but the ocean was out there, and it was calling him. He was working in music stores to make ends meet, another echo of his father's work ethic. He was selling guitars to kids who dreamed of being stars, while he, the man with the prodigious talent, was ringing up the register. The gap between his ability and his reality was widening, and in that gap the first shadows began to form: the hunger, the need to be heard, the feeling that he was destined for something massive, if only the world would wake up and pay attention. The 1980s were a strange time for a musician like Alan Woody. The musical landscape was shifting. The raw, organic sounds of the 70s were being replaced by synthesizers, drum machines, and polished hairspray production. It was the era of MTV, of image over substance. For a man who looked like a lumberjack and played like a jazz virtuoso, it wasn't an easy fit. He spent years in the trenches. He was a hired gun, a session man, a touring musician for hire. He played whatever gig paid the bills. This is the unglamorous reality of the professional musician: the endless loading of gear into vans, the sleeping in cheap motels, the playing of songs you don't particularly like for people who aren't really listening. But even in these wilderness years, his talent was undeniable. He landed a gig with Peter Criss, the former drummer of Kiss. This was a taste of the big leagues. Kiss was one of the biggest bands in the world, and even though Criss was on a solo venture, the orbit was huge. It gave Alan a taste of the rock star life, the riders, the travel, the adoration. But musically, it wasn't enough. It wasn't the challenge his classically trained brain craved. It was straight-ahead rock. It was fun, but it wasn't nourishing. He bounced around. He worked with Artemus Pyle, the drummer from Lynyrd Skynyrd, who had survived the tragic plane crash and was keeping the Skynyrd flame alive. This brought Alan closer to the flame of Southern rock, the genre that was arguably his spiritual birthright. He fit the mold perfectly here. The Southern rock ethos valued musicianship, it valued improvisation, it valued the jam. But by the late 80s, Southern rock was largely considered a dead language. It was viewed as a relic of the 70s, a dinosaur that had been killed by the meteor of punk and new wave. The Allman Brothers Band, the kings of the genre, had disbanded and reformed multiple times, plagued by drug abuse, infighting, and the lackluster albums of the early 80s. They were a nostalgia act, a ghost of their former glory. Alan Woody was drifting. He was approaching his mid-30s. In the music business, that's the danger zone. If you haven't made it by 30, the world starts to tell you to give up. The voice of his father, the voice of the construction worker, must have been loud in his head during these years. Is this it? Are you just going to be a sideman forever? When does the real life start? He began to collect instruments. It started slowly, then became a torrent. A bass here, a mandolin there. He would scour pawn shops in every town he visited. He became obsessed with the search. He was looking for a specific tone, a specific sound that he could hear in his head but couldn't quite produce with the gear he had. This collection, which would eventually swell to over 450 instruments, was not just a hobby. It was a symptom. It was a manifestation of a spiritual hole. He was trying to fill the void with wood and wire. He thought that if he just found the right 1960s Gibson Thunderbird, if he just found the perfect Epiphone rumble cat, he would feel complete. He would feel at peace. But objects, no matter how beautiful, cannot heal a soul. They can only distract it. The year was 1989. The Allman Brothers Band was preparing for their 20th anniversary, but the band was in a fragile state. They had lost their original bassist, Barry Oakley, to a motorcycle accident in 1972, a tragedy that still haunted the group. They had gone through other bass players, competent men, but no one who could truly replace the chaotic, melodic genius of Oakley. They needed new blood. They needed a spark. Dickie Betts, the Allman's legendary guitarist, and Greg, Allman, the soulful voice of the band, decided to hold auditions. They weren't just looking for a bass player, they were looking for a partner. They were also looking for a guitar player to play the foil to Dickie Betts, a role that the late Duane Allman had defined. Through the grapevine of the Southern music scene, the name Alan Woody surfaced. There's this guy in Nashville, people said. He's a monster. He plays like a lead guitarist. He knows theory. He's fearless. At the same time, another name was circulating for the guitar spot, Warren Haynes. Warren was a friend of Alan's. They were kindred spirits, both students of the genre, both immensely talented, both hungry. Alan Woody walked into the audition room. The air was thick with history. Standing there were Gregg Allman, Dickie Betts, Butch Trucks, and J-Mo, the surviving original members. These were the men who had written Whipping Post. These were the men who had invented the genre Alan grew up listening to. Most musicians would have played it safe. They would have stood in the back, played the root notes, and tried not to step on any toes. Alan Woody did not play it safe. He plugged in his bass, likely a massive Gibson with a sound like a diesel engine turning over, and he played. He didn't just support the band, he pushed them. He locked in with the drummers, Butch and J-Mo, creating a rhythmic wall that was impenetrable. But then he started to weave. He played melodic lines that danced around Dickie Betts's guitar. He played with a ferocity that shocked the older men. He wasn't asking for the job. He was taking it. In that room, something chemical happened. The band, which had been coasting on fumes and nostalgia, suddenly woke up. The energy shifted. It was aggressive. It was dangerous again. It sounded like 1969. Warren Haynes was hired as the guitarist. Alan Woody was hired as the bassist. It is no exaggeration to say that this moment saved the Allman Brothers Band. It wasn't just a reunion, it was a resurrection. Alan Woody didn't just fill a vacancy, he restored the band's spine. He brought the lead bass style of Barry Oakley back from the dead, but he infused it with his own jazz fusion technicality and a heavy modern aggression. For Alan, it was the mountaintop. He had done it. He had proven the doubters wrong. He had silenced the voice of the construction worker in his head. He was no longer just a local guy or a hired gun. He was an all-man brother. He was royalty. But heavy is the head that wears the crown. The Allman Brothers Band was not a knitting circle. It was a notorious, volatile, and drug-fueled organization with a history of tragedy. Alan was stepping into a machine that had chewed up and spit out lesser men. He was bringing his hunger, his talent, and his vulnerabilities into a high-pressure cooker of fame, touring, and temptation. The 90s were about to begin. The era of thunder was dawning. The stages would get bigger, the crowds would get louder, and the sound, that massive wall-shaking sound, would become his signature. But as the volume went up, the quiet corners of his life began to shrink. And in those shrinking corners, the old demons were waiting, patient and hungry. The early 1990s for the Allman Brothers Band was not a gentle stroll down memory lane. It was a full-throttle assault. With the addition of Alan Woody on bass and Warren Haynes on guitar, the band didn't just get younger, they got louder, much louder. Critics called it the best lineup since the original era of Duane Allman. That is a blasphemous statement in the Church of Southern Rock, but the tapes don't lie. Listen to Leave at Great Woods. The chemistry is terrifying. You have the founding fathers, Gregg Allman, Dickie Betts, Butch Trucks, and J-Mo, providing the authentic grit and swing. And then you have the new guys, Haynes and Woody, injecting a level of high-octane, heavy metal-adjacent ferocity that the band had never possessed before. Alan Woody was the engine of this change. On stage, he was a spectacle. He was a bear of a man, often clad in tie-dye or black, with long hair whipping around his face, stalking the stage like a predator. He didn't stand still. He played the bass with his entire body. He would lock eyes with Butch Trucks, the band's hard-hitting drummer, and they would drive the rhythm section like a freight train running downhill with no brakes. But it was his sound that redefined the era. Allman wasn't interested in a polite, thumping bass tone. He wanted to occupy the sonic space that usually belonged to a rhythm guitarist or a keyboard. He used massive Ampeg SVT amplifiers, refrigerators of sound, pushed to their absolute limit. He played Gibson Thunderbirds and Epiphone Rivoli basses, instruments known for their dark, muddy, earth-shaking growl. He introduced the concept of the lead bass back into the mainstream. On songs like Whipping Post, he wouldn't just hold the bottom. He would engage in musical combat with Dickie Betts. They would trade licks. Woody would climb high up the neck of the bass, playing chords, trills, and distorted runs that sounded like a cello being played through a fuzz box. It was the education of Vanderbilt meeting the aggression of a bar fight. The album's 7 Turns and Shades of Two Worlds were critical and commercial successes. The band was packing amphitheaters. The money was rolling in. For Alan Woody, the former music store clerk and hired gun, this was the dream realized. He was on the cover of magazines. He was endorsed by Gibson. He was a hero to a new generation of bass players who saw him as the man who made the bass cool again. But inside the Allman Brothers machine, there was a restlessness. The band was a democracy, but some votes counted more than others. The creative direction was still largely controlled by the founding members, particularly Dickie Betts. While Woody and Haynes were allowed to contribute, they were still in the grand hierarchy the new guys. They were employees of a legacy, guardians of a flame that wasn't entirely theirs. And Alan Woody had too much music in him to be just a guardian. He had a different sound in his head, something darker, heavier, and grimmier than the sunny major key jams of the Allman Brothers. He wanted to play the blues, but not the happy blues. He wanted the blues that sounded like a heroin withdrawal in a dirty basement. He wanted the sound of 1969 London mixed with 1994 Seattle. The genesis of Gov't Mule is one of the great legends of rock history. It didn't start in a boardroom or a recording studio. It started on a tour bus. During the endless Allman Brothers tours of the early 90s, Alan Woody and Warren Haynes found themselves bonding over their shared record collections. While the rest of the band might have been resting or engaging in their own rituals, Woody and Haynes were in the back of the bus, drinking beer and listening to the power trios of the late 60s, Cream, the Jimi Hendrix Experience, Mountain, James Gang. They became obsessed with the power trio format: guitar, bass, drums, no keyboards to hide behind, no second guitarist to fill the silence. In a trio, there is nowhere to hide. Everyone has to work 110% of the time. It is the most demanding and the most liberating format in rock and roll. Alan missed the improvisation of jazz fusion, but he wanted it delivered with the crushing weight of Black Sabbath. He looked at Warren one night, probably somewhere on a highway between St. Louis and Chicago, and said, we need to do this. We need to make this noise. They recruited Matt Apts, a drummer Warren had known from his days in the Dickie Betts band. Matt was the missing piece. He wasn't just a drummer. He was a percussionist with the swing of a jazz player and the power of John Bonham. In 1994, Gov't Mule was born. It was supposed to be a side project, a way to blow off steam during the Allman Brothers off-season. They recorded their self-titled debut album live in the studio, with almost no overdubs. It was raw, ugly, and beautiful. The sound of Gov't Mule was entirely centered around Alan Woody. Because there was no rhythm guitar, Alan had to fill that space. He developed a technique where he would strum the bass like a flamenco guitar, using a distorted biamped signal. He split his signal, one amp playing the clean low bass notes and another amp playing a distorted high-end growl. The result was a wall of sound that sounded like three people playing at once. Songs like Mule and Thorazine Shuffle became instant classics in the underground rock scene. This wasn't radio rock. It was music for musicians. It was music for people who liked their rock and roll with a layer of grease on it. For Alan, Gov't Mule was freedom. In the Allman Brothers, he had to play Ramblin' Man the same way every night because the audience demanded it. In Gov't Mule, there were no rules. They could turn a 3-minute blues song into a 20-minute psychedelic exploration. They could cover Al Green 1 minute and Black Sabbath the next. It was his baby. It was his vision. But babies, as any parent knows, require immense amounts of energy, and Alan Woody was about to stretch himself to the breaking point. From 1994 to 1997, Alan Woody lived a life that would have killed a lesser man. He was pulling the double shift. He was a full-time member of the Allman Brothers Band, touring the summer amphitheater circuit, playing 3-hour shows to 20,000 people a night. Then, on the band's days off, or immediately after a tour ended, he would jump into a van with Gov't Mule and play smoky clubs for 300 people, lugging his own gear, sleeping in cheap motels, and driving through the night. The physical toll was astronomical, and we have to talk about the instruments. Alan Woody's obsession with tone led him to play some of the most unergonomic instruments ever created. He fell in love with the Gibson EB1, a violin-shaped bass that is notoriously heavy and unbalanced. He played the Gibson Thunderbird, a bass with a neck so long it feels like you're holding a telephone pole. But the crowning jewel of his physical destruction was his custom-made double-neck instruments. Gibson built him a monster, a bass with a 4-string neck on the bottom and an 8-string neck on top. These instruments weighed over 15 pounds. Imagine hanging a 15-pound weight around your neck by a strap. Now imagine jumping around stage with it, headbanging, sweating, and playing complex musical passages for 3 hours straight. Now do that for 200 nights a year. His spine began to revolt. The discs in his back were being ground to dust. The knees were taking a pounding. He was a big man, often overweight due to the poor diet of the road, which compounded the stress on his frame. Pain became his constant companion. In the beginning, it was manageable. A couple of ibuprofen here, a few beers there to numb the ache after the show. It's the standard roadie cocktail. Walk it off. The show must go on. This is the ethos of the road dog. You don't complain about pain, you play through it. But the pain didn't go away. It dug in. It became a sharp, stabbing presence in his lower back, a dull roar in his neck. And as the pain increased, the remedies had to get stronger. This is where the tragedy begins to whisper. It wasn't a sudden fall into depravity. It was a slow medical descent. He visited doctors. He got prescriptions, muscle relaxers, painkillers, opiates. At first it was legitimate. He was hurting. He needed to function. He had a job to do, 2 jobs in fact. He couldn't call in sick to the Beacon Theater. He couldn't tell Warren Haynes, I can't play tonight, my back hurts. Not in the macho world of Southern rock. So he took the pill, and the pain went away. And along with the pain, the anxiety of performing, the stress of travel, the loneliness of the hotel room, that went away too. It was a warm, fuzzy blanket in a cold world. And Alan Woody, the man who gave so much warmth to the audience, desperately needed some for himself. By 1997, the double life was becoming unsustainable, not just physically, but creatively. Gov't Mule was gaining momentum. They had a rabid cult following. They were recording brilliant albums like Dose, but they were always living in the shadow of the Allman Brothers. Whenever the Allmans called, Gov't Mule had to pause. Warren Haynes and Alan Woody found themselves standing at a terrifying crossroads. On one side lay the Allman Brothers Band, a fortress of safety, lucrative paychecks, and first-class travel. It was a world of massive crowds and guaranteed rock star status, a golden cage of comfort. On the other side lay the unknown abyss of committing to Gov't Mule full-time. It was a move defined by risk. There were no guarantees of money, only the certainty of struggle. To chase this dream, they would have to trade arenas for sweaty clubs, swap the luxury tour bus for a cramped van, and exchange a life of certainty for absolute chaos. For Alan, the gravity of this choice was crushing. It wasn't just about the music, it was about survival. He had a wife, Jenny, and a young daughter, Savannah, depending on him. Walking away from the Allman Brothers meant voluntarily stripping away his financial armor. It meant taking the safety of his family's future and placing it squarely on the unpredictable, unforgiving roulette wheel of the music industry. But Alan Woody was an artist first and a businessman second. He looked at the Allman Brothers and saw a museum piece. He looked at Gov't Mule and saw a living, breathing animal. He saw a legacy he could build with his own hands, not one he was renting from Greg Allman. On March 26, 1997, Alan Woody and Warren Haynes sent shockwaves through the music world. They announced they were leaving the Allman Brothers Band. The industry thought they were insane. Who walks away from the Allman Brothers? It was a declaration of independence. It was a statement that art mattered more than commerce, but it also removed the safety net. Now Gov't Mule had to succeed. If they failed, Alan Woody would just be another unemployed bass player with a bad back. The pressure ramped up. The U.S. against the world mentality took over. Gov't Mule hit the road with a vengeance. They toured relentlessly. They became the hardest working band in America, and Alan Woody became the heart of that beast. He was the MC on stage, the one who talked to the crowd, the one with the dry, sarcastic wit. He was the beloved uncle to the fans. He would hang out by the bus after shows, talking about vintage gear, signing autographs, sharing a beer. He was accessible. He was Woody. But the increased workload meant increased pain. And now, without the Allman Brothers infrastructure, the travel was harder. The bus rides were bumpier. The load-ins were rougher. The collection of instruments continued to grow, spiraling into an obsession. He was buying obscure Italian basses from the 60s, strange Japanese guitars, anything with strings. He was building a fortress of instruments around himself. Friends began to worry. It seemed manic. It seemed like he was trying to buy happiness, one eBay auction at a time. As the late 90s approached, the sound of Gov't Mule and Alan's playing got darker. The album Life Before Insanity is a haunting masterpiece. The title itself is a prophecy. Alan's bass lines became thicker, more distorted. He was experimenting with lower tunings. He was digging into the mud. The music was reflecting his internal state. The heroin had entered the picture. It's hard to pinpoint exactly when the line was crossed from pain management to addiction. It's always a blurry line, but those in his inner circle began to notice changes. The nodding off, the erratic moods, the pinpoint pupils. Heroin is a jealous lover. It demands everything. It isolates you. Even in a band of brothers like Gov't Mule, the addict is always alone. He is alone in the bathroom. He is alone in the bunk. He is alone in his head. Alan was functioning, high functioning in fact. He never missed a show. He never played a bad note. His hands were still golden, but the light in his eyes was dimming. The thunder was still there, but the lightning, the spark of joy, was becoming harder to find. He was trying to be everything to everyone. The rock star, the father, the husband, the collector, the friend. And beneath it all, he was a man in agonizing physical pain, terrified that if he stopped moving, the whole machine would crash. So he kept moving, he kept playing, he kept taking the medicine. The year 2000 arrived, a new millennium. Gov't Mule was at the peak of their creative powers. They were preparing for a massive fall tour. They were writing new material. The future looked bright, but shadows are longest just before the sun goes down. And in August of 2000, the sun was getting very low over Queens, New York. August in New York City is a physical ordeal. The concrete traps the heat. The humidity rises from the subway grates like steam from a cauldron, and the air feels thick enough to chew. It was into this oppressive, sticky atmosphere that Gov't Mule arrived in late August 2000. They weren't there to play a sold-out show at the Roseland Ballroom. They weren't there to tear the roof off the Beacon Theater. They were there for the unglamorous bureaucratic side of the music business. They were in town for meetings, promotional work, and to discuss the future of the band. They were staying at the Marriott Courtyard near LaGuardia Airport in Queens. The location is significant. This wasn't the rock and roll epicenter of Manhattan. It wasn't the Chelsea Hotel with its ghosts of Sid Vicious and Dylan Thomas. It was a transit hub, a place of arrivals and departures, a place where you stay when you are just passing through. Alan Woody was in good spirits according to those who saw him, or at least he put on a good show. That was the thing about Alan. He was a professional. He knew how to turn it on. He was the funny guy, the storyteller, the one with the quick wit and the encyclopedic knowledge of obscure British sitcoms and vintage gear. But physically, he was worn down. He had been battling a severe sinus infection. His back, the constant tormentor of his existence, was flaring up. He was tired. Not just didn't get enough sleep, tired, but a bone-deep existential exhaustion that comes from 20 years of lifting heavy amps and sleeping in moving vehicles. On Friday, August 25th, the band had some downtime. It wasn't a wild night. There were no groupies, no trashed hotel rooms, no headlines in the making. It was the mundane reality of the road. A meal, a few drinks, a laugh with Warren Haynes and Matt Apts. Warren and Alan were more than bandmates. They were musical soulmates. They communicated without speaking. On stage, they could change the key of a jam session with a simple nod or a raised eyebrow. Off stage, they had the easy, comfortable silence of brothers. But even brothers have secrets. Even soulmates have corners of their hearts that they keep locked away. That evening, Alan retreated to his room. He needed to rest. He needed to prepare for an early flight or a meeting the next day. He closed the door to the room that would become the final stop on his journey. What happened behind that closed door is a story told in the cold language of toxicology reports. But the emotional reality is far more tragic. Alan was in pain. He was sick. He was likely feeling the onset of withdrawal, or perhaps just the desperate need to numb the physical agony of his crumbling spine so he could get a few hours of sleep. He made a choice he had likely made hundreds of times before without consequence. He prepared a fix. He sought the oblivion of the opiate. He didn't want to die. He just wanted to stop hurting. He just wanted the noise in his head and the pain in his back to be quiet for a while. He lay down on the bed. The air conditioner hummed its monotone drone. The traffic of Queens rolled on outside, and Alan Woody, the Thunder, closed his eyes. Saturday morning, August 26th. The sun rose over Queens, baking the asphalt of the hotel parking lot. The band had a schedule to keep. Rock and roll is a business, and the itinerary is God. Warren Haynes and Matt Apts were ready. The van was waiting. The tour manager was checking the list. Everyone was accounted for, except Woody. This wasn't entirely unusual. Alan was not a morning person. Musicians rarely are. He was probably sleeping in, snoring loudly, oblivious to the alarm clock. Someone probably made a joke about Woody time. "Go wake the bear," someone might have said. The phone in his room rang. No answer. It rang again. No answer. A knot of anxiety began to tighten in the stomachs of those waiting in the lobby. You know that feeling. The intuition that something is slightly off beat. The silence on the other end of the line wasn't just an unanswered call. It felt heavy. The tour manager went up to the room, a knock on the door. "Woody, Alan, we gotta go, man." Nothing. Just the hum of the hotel. They got the key card. Maybe from the front desk, maybe a spare. The electronic lock clicked, a small plastic sound that would divide history into before and after. The door swung open. The room was still, too still. The air was chilled by the AC. And there was Alan, lying on the bed. He looked peaceful. He wasn't sprawled out in agony. He looked like he was deep in a dream. But when they touched him, the reality crashed into the room with the force of a physical blow. He was cold. The vibrant, loud, chaotic life force that was Alan Woody had left the building. Panic, denial, the frantic call to 911. "We need an ambulance, Marriott Courtyard, Queens. Please hurry." But there is no hurry when the race is already over. The paramedics arrived, but their job was merely a formality. There was no pulse to find, no breath to restore. At 44 years old, one of the greatest bass players to ever walk the earth was pronounced dead at the scene. The news hit the lobby like a bomb. Warren Haynes and Matt Apps stood in the wreckage of their world. You have to understand the dynamic of a power trio. It is a three-legged stool. If you remove one leg, it doesn't just wobble, it collapses instantly. For Warren, this was the loss of his musical other half. They had left the safety of the Allman brothers together. They had jumped off the cliff together, trusting that they could build wings on the way down. And they had done it. They had built Gov't Mule into a flying machine, and now, mid-flight, the wings had been ripped off. The phone calls began. The hardest phone calls anyone ever has to make. They had to call Jenny, his wife. They had to tell a mother that her husband wasn't coming home. They had to tell Savannah, his daughter, that her daddy, the giant with the gentle heart, was gone. The news began to leak out. In the pre-social media age of 2000, it moved through phone trees and early internet forums, like the Allman Brothers Band website. "Is it true? I heard Woody died." "No way, I just saw him last week." Denial is the first stage of grief, and the rock community was in deep denial. Alan Woody seemed indestructible. He was a mountain of a man. He was thunder. Thunder doesn't just stop. It fades away. It rolls into the distance. But it doesn't just vanish. By the afternoon, the confirmation came. The press releases were typed up. MTV News ran the ticker. Allman Brothers and Gov't Mule bassist Alan Woody found dead at 44. The cause of death was initially listed as unknown. This is the standard placeholder. But in the whispers of the industry, people knew. They knew about the back pain. They knew about the medicine. In the days following his death, the speculation was rampant. Was it a heart attack? He was a big guy. He ate road food. Was it a stroke? When the medical examiner's report finally came back, it confirmed the dark truth that many feared, but no one wanted to say out loud. Acute heroin intoxication. It wasn't a massive suicidal overdose. It was ruled an accident. It was a tragic miscalculation. It was the result of a body weakened by illness, exhausted by travel, and desperate for relief, encountering a drug that takes no prisoners. The revelation was a second blow to his legacy. In a world that often romanticizes the 27 Club and the tragic junkie genius, Alan didn't fit the mold. He wasn't a waif-like poet like Kurt Cobain. He wasn't a chaotic punk like Sid Vicious. He was a professional. He was a scholar of music. He was a father. This made the truth harder to swallow, but also more important. It highlighted the fact that addiction doesn't care. if you have a degree from Vanderbilt. It doesn't care if you are the backbone of the Allman brothers. It is a predator that hunts the weak, the tired, and the hurting. Alan Woody didn't die because he wanted to get high in a party sense. He died because he was hurting. And the system of touring, performing, and the show must go on had left him with few options to manage that pain. He self-medicated, and he paid the ultimate price. The funeral was a gathering of the tribes. The Southern rock royalty descended on Nashville to bury one of their own. Greg Allman, Dickie Betts, Artemis Pyle, the members of the Black Crowes, they were all there. But the atmosphere wasn't just sad, it was disoriented. There was a sense of, what do we do now? During the service, the Canadian band Big Sugar, friends of Alan's, performed a song called Nashville Grass. It was a haunting, beautiful tribute. The lyrics spoke of the earth, of returning home, of the cycle of life. There wasn't a dry eye in the house, but the most poignant moment wasn't the music. It was the silence. When a bass player stops playing, you notice the lack of bottom end. The music becomes thin. It loses its punch. At the funeral, the world felt thin. The gravity that Alan Woody generated, both with his instrument and his personality, was gone. Warren Haynes looked like a man who had lost a limb. He was facing a future that was suddenly blank. Gov't Mule was Woody's band as much as it was his. How could it continue? Should it continue? There were conversations, hushed and tentative, about the future. You can't replace Woody. Maybe we should just break up. Maybe we should go back to the Allman brothers. But Warren knew one thing. Alan wouldn't want the music to stop. Alan was a student of history. He knew that bands like the Allman brothers had survived the death of Dwayne. He knew that Leonard Skynyrd had survived the plane crash. He knew that the music is bigger than the musician. But how do you replace the irreplaceable? How do you fill a hole the size of a mountain? Gov't Mule canceled their upcoming tour. They retreated into the shadows. They needed to grieve. They needed to figure out who they were without their heartbeat. In the weeks that followed, a strange phenomenon occurred. The grief of the rock community transformed into action. Bass players from all over the world began to reach out, not to ask for the job, that would be disrespectful, but to pay tribute. Flea from the Red Hot Chili Peppers, Les Claypool from Primus, Mike Gordon from Phish, Stefan Lessard from Dave Matthews Band, Jack Bruce from Cream. They all sent messages. We loved him. He was the best of us. If you need anything. And in that outpouring of love, an idea began to form in Warren Haynes' mind. A crazy, ambitious, beautiful idea. An idea that Alan Woody, the collector of instruments and the lover of jams, would have absolutely adored. If no single man could replace Alan Woody, maybe it would take all of them. The months following August 2000 were a dark winter for Gov't Mule. The band was in cryostasis, the fans were in mourning, the internet forums were filled with tributes sharing bootleg recordings of Woody's greatest solos, dissecting the tragedy, trying to make sense of the senseless. But behind the scenes, Warren Haynes was orchestrating one of the most ambitious tribute projects in the history of rock music. He decided that Gov't Mule would return to the studio, not to find a new bass player, but to record a tribute album. He called everyone, and everyone said yes. This wasn't just a guest appearance situation. The greatest bass players in the world flew to the studio to record tracks with Warren and Matt. They weren't just playing bass, they were stepping into the holy ground that Woody had occupied. Jack Bruce, the legendary bassist of Cream, one of Woody's biggest heroes, came to sing and play. It was a full circle moment. Woody had modeled his power trio concept on Cream, and now the bassist of Cream was playing on a track to honor him. John Entwistle of The Who contributed his legendary thunder to the project, marking one of his final recordings before his own tragic passing. Bootsy Collins brought the funk, Leigh Claypool brought the weirdness, Jason Newsted brought the metal. It was a healing process. Each bassist brought their own style, but they all acknowledged the difficulty of the task. They all said the same thing. Man, Woody played a lot of notes. Trying to replicate his energy was exhausting. It highlighted just how unique Alan was. He played with the busyness of a lead guitarist, but the weight of a rhythmic anchor. This project, which would eventually become the Deep End Volumes 1 and 2, was the bridge. It allowed the band to keep moving without feeling like they were replacing their brother immediately. It allowed them to grieve through music, but a studio album is one thing. The road is another. Eventually, Gov't Mule had to play live again, and this led to the most poignant image of the post-Woody era, the One for Woody concert. Held at the Roseland Ballroom in New York, the city where he died, it was a wake, a celebration, and an exorcism. The Allman Brothers played, the Black Crowes played, Phil Lesh of the Grateful Dead played. But when Gov't Mule took the stage, the absence was physical. There was a microphone stand where Woody used to stand. There was a spotlight on an empty space. For the fans in the audience, seeing Warren and Matt play without Woody was heartbreaking. It felt wrong. It felt like a car driving on three wheels. But as the music swelled, as the guest bassists rotated in and out, a realization settled over the crowd. The thunder was gone, yes, but the echo was deafening. Alan Woody had built a foundation so strong that even in his death it could hold up the weight of the world's grief. He had created a repertoire of songs, Banks of the Deep End, Beautifully Broken, that would now take on new crushing meanings. But the story doesn't end with the tribute. The story ends with the lingering question, what did we lose? What was the cost of that 450 bass collection? What was the hole in the center of the man that no amount of volume could fill? To answer that, we have to look at the final chapter of his legacy. We have to look at what remains today, 25 years later, and what Alan Woody teaches us about the fragile, beautiful, and dangerous pursuit of the perfect sound. How do you replace a hurricane? That was the existential question facing Gov't Mule as the numbness of 2000 faded into the reality of 2001 and beyond. The Deep End project had been a beautiful Band-Aid, a way to keep the patient alive with transfusions of love from the world's greatest players. But you cannot tour with 25 different bass players. You cannot build a future on guest stars. Eventually, the circus has to leave town, and the band has to become a band again. Warren Haynes and Matt Abts found themselves in a position that no musician envies. They had to audition people to fill the shoes of a legend. And the problem wasn't just skill. There are thousands of bass players who can play the notes Alan Woody played. You can go to Berklee College of Music and find a 19-year-old kid who can shred Thorazine Shuffle faster and cleaner than Woody ever did. But Gov't Mule wasn't about clean, and it wasn't just about notes. Alan Woody was a reactive player. He played the bass like a lead instrument. He didn't just hold the bottom, he engaged in a constant pugilistic conversation with Warren's guitar. If Warren went left, Woody went right. If Warren went quiet, Woody went loud. They had a telepathy born of thousands of hours, on buses, in vans, and on stages. You can't audition for telepathy. For 3 years, Gov't Mule existed as a fluid entity. They toured with Dave Schools from Widespread Panic, a man with a heavy, enveloping sound who brought a different kind of gravity. They played with Oteil Burbridge, a virtuoso with a jazz background who could dance on the fretboard. But it wasn't until 2003 that they finally settled on Andy Hess. Hess was a brilliant player, a groove master. He brought a stability to the band, a pocket that was deep and wide. But even then, the sound was different. It was cleaner. It was more polite. The thunder, that chaotic, dangerous, on the verge of derailing train energy that Woody brought, was gone. Later, when Jorgen Carlson joined the band in 2008, a bit of that aggression returned. Carlson played with a pick. He played loud. He played distorted. Fans whispered, "He sounds like Woody." But even Jorgen would admit he was channeling a ghost. He was playing the role, but the script had been written by someone else. This revolving door of bassists served as a constant living reminder of just how unique Alan Woody was. In his absence, his genius became even more apparent. You don't realize how much weight a pillar is holding until you knock it out and the roof starts to sag. Alan Woody had been holding up the entire sonic architecture of the band with his massive, distorted shoulders. And then there were the instruments. When a musician dies, they leave behind more than just royalties and memories. They leave behind their tools. And in the case of Alan Woody, he left behind an armory, over 450 instruments. Guitars, basses, mandolins, double necks, sitars. It was a collection that bordered on the mythological. It was stored in lockers and basements, in cases that hadn't been opened in years. For his widow, Jenny, this collection was a heavy burden. It was a physical manifestation of his obsession, but also a financial asset that needed to be managed for the sake of their daughter, Savannah. The tragedy of the collector is that he never gets to play everything. There were basses in that collection that Alan had bought, stared at, played for 5 minutes, and then put away, chasing the next tone. It was a Citizen Kane scenario, a warehouse full of rosebuds. But there was one instrument that became his true final testament. Before he died, Alan had been working with Epiphone to design a signature bass. He wanted to create an instrument that had the vintage vibe of the 1960s Italian and Japanese basses he loved, but with modern playability. He designed the Rumble Cat. It was a short-scale, semi-hollow body bass. It looked like something from a pawn shop in 1966. It was wine red. It was cool. Sadly, Alan never saw the finished product in mass production. It was released posthumously. The Epiphone Alan Woody Rumble Cat became a cult classic and one of Epiphone's most popular signature models. It is a strange and beautiful legacy. Today, thousands of kids and old pros pick up that bass in music stores. They feel the neck. They hear that Woody thumping tone. They might not even know who Alan Woody was. They might just think it's a cool bass. But every time someone plugs a Rumble Cat into an amp and feels that low-end vibration, Alan Woody is speaking from the grave. He finally found the tone he was looking for, and he gave it to the world. We must now return to the question we asked at the very beginning. Why? Why does a man with a loving wife, a beautiful daughter, a successful career, and a degree from a prestigious music school end up dead in a Queen's hotel room with a needle's legacy in his veins? It is too easy to say rock and roll lifestyle. That is a cliche that dismisses the human pain. Alan Woody wasn't chasing a party. He wasn't a hedonist in the Motley Crue sense. The answer lies in the contradiction of his life. The primal wound of the Nashville boy who wanted to be a classical musician but ended up sweating in rock clubs. Alan Woody was a man of immense intellect, trapped in a world that valued brute force. He was the redneck Mozart. He had a brain that could dissect Stravinsky, but he was paid to shake the floorboards. There is a loneliness in that. There is a feeling of being misunderstood, even by the people cheering for you. They loved the thunder, but did they know the scholar behind it? And then there was the physical pain. We cannot overstate this. The human spine is not designed to hold a 15-pound double-neck guitar for 3 hours a night, 6 nights a week for 20 years. The chronic pain wore him down. It eroded his willpower. The collection of 450 basses was an attempt to fill the void. It is a common psychological trait among addicts and obsessives, the dopamine hit of finding a new gear treasure. If I just buy this 1962 Gibson, I will feel happy. If I just get this amp, the sound in my head will finally be real. But the sound in his head was silence. He was chasing a piece he couldn't find. The heroin was just the final fatal attempt to quiet the noise. It was a misguided attempt at medicine, not malice. He was a victim of the show must go on culture. In the year 2000, mental health and addiction were not discussed openly in tour buses. You didn't ask for a break. You didn't say, I'm sad or I'm hurting. You drank a whiskey, you took a pill, and you got in the van. Alan Woody was a strong man, a Southern man, and that strength was his undoing. He carried the weight until it crushed him. The most enduring tribute to Alan Woody is not a statue or a plaque. It is a song. After his death, Warren Haynes wrote Banks of the Deep End. It is a ballad, but not a sappy one. It is a conversation. The lyrics describe Warren walking down to the river, trying to find his friend in the water, in the sky, in the memory. And I hope you found what you were looking for. That line cuts to the core. It acknowledges the search. It acknowledges that Alan was looking for something, a sound, a feeling, a relief that this world couldn't provide. In the video for the song, the band is playing, and they show clips of Woody. He is laughing, he is playing pranks, he is hugging his bass. It captures the gentle giant that his friends knew. Savannah Woody, his daughter, grew up. She carries his legacy. She has appeared at Gov't Mule shows, a living reminder of the man who was taken too soon. The pain of the family is the part of the story that music cannot fix. The fans lost a bass player. They lost their world. 25 years have passed since that Saturday in Queens. The music world has moved on. New bands have formed. New heroes have risen. But the shadow of Alan Woody remains long and dark. When you listen to modern Southern rock bands like Blackberry Smoke or the new generation of jam bands, you hear his DNA. You hear bass players who aren't afraid to be loud. You hear bass players who step into the spotlight. That is Alan Woody's influence. He proved that the bass guitar is not a support instrument. It is a weapon of mass construction. He proved that you can be a redneck and a scholar. He proved that you can play the blues with the precision of jazz and the fury of metal. But his life serves as a warning, a buoy marking a dangerous reef. It reminds us that talent is not a shield against pain. It reminds us that the strong, silent type is a dangerous role to play. It reminds us that even the loudest thunder eventually fades into silence, and we must take care of the people who make the music we love. If you go back and listen to Gov't Mule's live recordings from 1999, just before the end, you can hear it. You can hear a man playing for his life. The bass lines are thick, distorted, swirling, and angry. They are fighting against the dying of the light. Alan Woody didn't conquer his demons. In the end, they took him. But in the battle, in the friction between his pain and his passion, he created a sound that will never die. He turned his struggle into a vibration that still shakes the chest of anyone who puts on a Gov't Mule record. He was the thunder. And even though the storm has passed, the ground is still shaking. The story of Alan Woody is not just a rock tragedy. It is a human tragedy wrapped in a cautionary tale. It forces us to ask, what are we collecting? What are we using to numb our pain? And are we listening to the people around us, or are we just hearing the music? In the end, all those instruments weren't enough to save him. But one bass, the one he held in his hands on stage, was enough to save the Allman brothers, to birth Gov't Mule, and to change the lives of millions of listeners. Rest in peace, Woody. The low end is lonely without you.